Picture it. It's December 1944. Deep in the frozen hell of the Ardennes, American GIs huddle in their foxholes, terrified as German Panther tanks roll through their lines as if they were made of paper. These monsters weigh 45 tons. Their sloped armor can't be dented by the Americans. Shell after shell glistens through their steel hulls without harm as they methodically hunt down Allied tanks one by one. Even the 75mm guns on American Shermans can't spit out enough to stop them. It's a massacre, and the Germans know it. They're laughing on their radio nets, calling American tanks Tommy Kickers and Ronson Lighters because they catch fire so easily. But then something new appears on the battlefield through the swirling snow and smoke. It's low, angular, and the gun barrel is so long it looks like a telephone pole mounted on tracks. The German tank commander is peering through his periscope, frantically flipping through his identification manual. He's never seen anything like it. The breech closes with a metallic clang. A voice shouts, "Fire!" The ground shakes, and suddenly the invincible Panther explodes in a ball of fire that lights up the entire forest. The turret, all 15 tons of it, cartwheels through the air like a beer can. In that moment, everything changes. The hunters have just become the hunted. Before you go anywhere, I need you to do me a big favor. This is the kind of forgotten history that the YouTube algorithm absolutely loves to bury. So, if you want to see more incredible stories like this, smash that subscribe button now. Seriously, do it before you forget, because what I'm about to tell you about America's secret weapon will blow your mind. And you definitely don't want to miss what's coming up next in this series. What you just witnessed was the combat debut of the most fearsome tank destroyer in American history. A machine so effective that German commanders began to have nightmares about its distinctive silhouette. In their panic, they called it the long gun in radio transmissions. But American crews had a different name for it, the M36 Jackson. And the story of how this absolute monster came to be is even more incredible than its battlefield performance. This wasn't just another tank rolling off the assembly line. This was a weapon born of pure desperation, designed by engineers who were literally racing against time, while American boys were dying in their burning Shermans thousands of miles away. The 90mm gun mounted on this beast was so powerful that it could punch through 9 inches of solid steel armor at over 1,000 yards. To put that into perspective, the Tiger tank had enough firepower to go straight through the front plate and out the other side, taking half its crew with it. But here's something that will shock you. This game-changing weapon almost never existed. In fact, there were generals in the Pentagon who wanted to cancel the entire project a few months before D-Day. They thought it was too little, too late. Thank God they were wrong, because without the M36 Jackson, the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge could have been very different. And when I say that, I'm not exaggerating. We're talking about a weapon that appeared so late in the war that most German tank crews never saw it before it killed them. Imagine being in a Tiger tank, feeling completely invincible because no Allied gun ever threatened you, and then suddenly, this mysterious machine appears out of nowhere and vaporizes your friend's Panther with a single shot. It's psychological warfare at its best. The story begins in the summer of 1943 in a nondescript office building in Detroit, where American engineers were poring over intelligence reports that made their blood run cold. The Germans had made the impossible possible. They had built tanks that were essentially immune to every weapon in the American arsenal. The new Panther tanks rolling off the German production lines had frontal armor that was 5 inches thick and sloped at such an angle that American shells literally bounced off them like ping-pong balls. Even worse, they were armed with fast, reliable, and high-velocity 75mm guns that could hit a Sherman from over 2 miles away. It was like bringing a knife to a gunfight, except the other guy had a machine gun, and you had a butter knife. The situation was so dire that American tank crews in Italy were putting extra steel plates on their Shermans. Not because it would actually stop a German shell, but because it made them feel a little less like they were walking into a death trap. Morale was in the toilet. Veteran tank commanders were requesting transfers to the infantry, and that should tell you all you need to know about how bad things had gotten. Infantry. These were the guys who wanted to face German machine guns on foot, rather than climb into another Sherman and go up against a Panther. But while American tankers were being slaughtered in Europe, in the States, a small group of brilliant engineers were working on something that would change everything. They would be studying captured German guns, analyzing every piece of intelligence they could get their hands on, and they would come to a startling conclusion. The answer to America's tank problem wasn't in the motor pool. It was in the sky. The U.S. military developed an incredible 90mm anti-aircraft gun to shoot down German bombers. The thing was a monster. It was designed to fire 40-pound shells at aircraft flying at 30,000 feet and 300 miles per hour. The muzzle velocity was absolutely insane, about 3,000 feet per second, which meant its shells hit like the fist of an angry god. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Some brilliant engineer whose name has been lost to history, but who deserves a statue in his honor, came up with a crazy idea after looking at this massive anti-aircraft gun. What if instead of shooting at planes, it was pointed at German tanks? The math was simple but devastating. A shell traveling at 3,000 feet per second doesn't care how thick your armor is. Physics is physics, and kinetic energy increases with the square of velocity. In other words, this thing wouldn't just penetrate German armor. It would just disappear. The problem was getting this monster onto the battlefield. The anti-aircraft version weighed over 7 tons and required a large crew to operate it. It was as mobile as a concrete bunker, which made it completely useless for tank warfare, where mobility meant survival. They needed to somehow shrink that cannon and mount it on something that could sustain fast-moving armored battles. The solution came from another stroke of genius. Instead of starting from scratch, they would modify an existing platform. The M10 tank destroyer had done a decent job against older German tanks, but its 3-inch gun was woefully inadequate against the new Panthers and Tigers. However, its hull was solid, reliable, and most importantly, it was already in production. Engineers realized they could take the M10's turret off and replace it with something bigger, one that could handle the massive 90mm cannon. It was like taking the engine out of a sports car and dropping it into a rocket motor. Theoretically possible, but practically insane. The project was given the highest priority rating, and teams of engineers worked around the clock to make it happen. They had to completely redesign the turret to accommodate the bigger gun. The new turret was big, heavy, and needed a large counterweight at the rear to keep the whole thing from tipping over when the gun moved forward. They called this counterweight part the shim, and it stuck out behind the turret like the tail of some prehistoric beast. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. But here's where the story gets even more depressing. By early 1944, the situation in Europe had become critical. The Germans had begun mass-producing Panthers, and American casualties were rising at an alarming rate. Every day that the M36 project was delayed meant more American boys were coming home in body bags. The pressure was so intense that engineers were literally sleeping in their offices, working 18-hour days to get prototypes ready for testing. The first test firing was scheduled for March 1944 at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. Picture the scene. A group of Army officers, engineers and brass from Washington, all standing behind a security barrier, watched the first M36 prototype being moved into position. The target was a captured German Panther tank, 1,000 yards down the range. It was the moment of truth. Either this crazy idea would work, or they would waste months of valuable time and resources on a massive failure. The gunner lined up his bullet. The breech closed with a metallic slam that echoed across the proving ground. And then came the moment that changed everything. The 90-millimeter gun roared like the roar of Thor, and the Panther was gone. The armor-piercing shell hit the front plate and went through it like it was made of cheese. The rear plate bulged outward and then exploded, sending steel shards flying hundreds of yards. The interior of the tank was completely destroyed. Every piece of equipment turned to twisted scrap metal. There was silence for about 5 seconds, and then someone started cheering. Within minutes, the entire field was in a celebratory mood. They had done it. They had created a weapon that could not only threaten German heavy tanks, but destroy them outright. The tests were repeated against different targets at different ranges with different types of ammunition. The results were consistent. The M36 Jackson was a tank killer without equal. Production was approved immediately, and by the summer of 1944, the first M36s were rolling off the assembly lines in Detroit. But getting them to the battlefield was another challenge entirely. The invasion of Normandy had already taken place, and every available ship was being used to ferry men and supplies to the beach. Tank destroyers were not considered a priority over regular Sherman tanks and artillery pieces. This was frustrating for the crews who had trained on these machines and knew what they could do. The first M36s finally arrived in France in August 1944, just in time for the breakout from the Normandy hedgerows. The crews who received them were shocked by what they saw. After months of feeling helpless in the face of German weapons, they suddenly had a weapon that looked like it could take on the world. The gun barrel was so long that it had to be supported by a travel lock when moving. And the whole machine had a barely perceptible aura of violence that was impossible to ignore. But the fighting would prove that the M36, while incredibly powerful, was far from perfect. The open-top turret, which was essential to save weight and improve visibility, proved a nightmare in the field. Rain would pour directly onto the crew, making operations miserable during the wet European autumn. Worse, the open top made them vulnerable to artillery fire and even rifle fire from higher positions. Crews quickly learned to improvise, welding steel plates over their heads, or rigging canvas covers to keep the elements out. The real problem, though, was ammunition. The special high-velocity armor-piercing rounds that made the M36 so deadly were incredibly scarce. Each shell cost more to manufacture than some entire weapon systems, and the complex production process meant that supplies were always in short supply. Most M36 crews were issued only a few silver bullets and were ordered to save them for the most dangerous targets. Regular armor-piercing shells were effective against medium tanks, but struggled with the heaviest German armor. The first major test came during the pursuit across France in the late summer of 1944. German Panther tanks were withdrawing from the fight, setting up ambush positions, and then retreating when the pressure became too great. This was exactly the kind of warfare the M36 was designed for. The long gun gave American crews the ability to engage at a wide range, removing the Panthers from positions where the Germans could not effectively counter. Staff Sergeant Mike O'Brien, commanding an M36 from the 776th Tank Destroyer Battalion, described his first kill in a letter. "We were passing through a small village in France when our lead Sherman suddenly exploded. About 800 yards away, a Panther stood behind a stone wall, waiting for us to get into its kill zone. In the old days, we had to call for artillery or air support, and by the time help arrived, that Panther would have been long gone. But now we had a long gun. I told my gunner to put one of our special rounds in its front plate, and that's exactly what happened. The Panther literally came apart at the seams. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen." Stories like this spread quickly through American forces in Europe. The M36 crew was becoming legendary, and German intelligence was starting to take notice. Documents obtained from this period show that German commanders were desperately trying to figure out what this new American weapon was. They knew it existed because their tank crews were reporting long-range kills from guns that shouldn't have been able to penetrate Panther armor. But they had no idea what they were dealing with. The mystery deepened because production numbers of the M36 were relatively small. Unlike the thousands of Sherman tanks that roamed Europe, there were only a few hundred Jacksons in the entire theater. They appeared suddenly, knocked out a few German tanks, and then disappeared before anyone could get a good look at them. German tank crews began referring to them as ghost guns because they seemed to appear out of nowhere, strike with devastating effect, and then disappear. Psychological effect was almost as important as the physical devastation the M36 caused. German Panther and Tiger crews had grown accustomed to being the top predators on the battlefield. They moved forward confidently, knowing that no Allied weapon could seriously threaten them at long range. The M36 shattered that confidence completely. Suddenly, every engagement was potentially deadly. That distinctive long gun silhouette became a death knell for German armored forces. But the real test was yet to come. In December 1944, Adolf Hitler launched his last major offensive of the war, sending Germany's remaining armored forces through the Ardennes forest in what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. It was the largest concentration of German weapons since the early days of the war, including dozens of Tiger and Panther tanks, as well as the fearsome King Tiger, a 70-ton monster with armor so thick that it was virtually immune to most Allied weapons. The initial German attack was devastating. All American units were overwhelmed or surrounded, and it seemed that the enemy might actually succeed in splitting the Allied forces and capturing the vital port of Antwerp. In this desperate situation, every available M36 was rushed to the front lines. Tank destroyer battalions were broken up, and their Jacksons were distributed wherever they were needed. This was a pivotal moment for the entire program. In the town of St. Vane, a key road junction that the Germans were to completely capture, elements of the 7th Armored Division had established a defensive perimeter. Their forces included 6 M36 tank destroyers, positioned in carefully chosen ambush positions, with clear fields of fire. The crews had spent hours studying the terrain, making range cards, and preparing for the attack they knew was coming. The German attack began with Panther tanks before dawn on December 17th. The morning fog was so thick that visibility was limited to a few hundred yards, which should have favored the attacking Germans. But the M36 crews had done their homework. They knew exactly where the enemy would appear, and their guns were trained on those positions. Corporal Danny Martinez was the gunner of one of the M36s when the first Panther emerged from the fog. It was a scene from a horror movie. He later recalled, "This massive shape just came out of nowhere, moving quickly and heading straight for our position. I could see the muzzle flash from its gun as it fired at something to our left. My commander whispered, 'Target identified. Panther tank 800 yards. Fire when ready.' I lined up the shot, took a deep breath, and squeezed the trigger. The gun went off like a bolt of lightning, and through the smoke, I could see the Panther simply disintegrate. The turret flew off to one side, the hull went off to the other, and it was a huge fireball that lit up the hottest thing on the entire battlefield. The effect was felt throughout the area, and the American defenders suddenly realized that they had a weapon that could actually damage German heavy tanks, while the crews learned that their supposedly invincible Panthers were being destroyed by an unknown weapon. Making their presence felt in the front lines, a King Tiger led by Sergeant First Class Robert Tank Thompson had the 90mm gun reliably engaged, but Thompson ordered his driver to fire at full speed. The result was that the two tanks circled each other, and finally he scored a round from the King Tiger that shook buildings half a mile away. These men knew that they were operating a weapon that they were fighting. Their survival depended on there being no margin for error. Need your help covering military history, and we can forget you this amazing if you are helping us. Do me a huge favor and hit the like button. But this brings the video to second place. You are on it. tell me what you think of the Jackson. Do you think it was the best tank of the war, or any other vehicle that lasted for over a month? And during this desperate struggle, the crew of the M36 had their names written on it, that many were achieved by one man. The longest range tank of the entire war saw a Panther tank at 4,000 yards, visible even through its powerful telescope. Most of the tank crews did not even try to fire a shot, and it was doing the wrong amount of damage. But Pinto had been studying this particular Panther, calculating its maneuverability, ordering his gunner to save for an emergency, and could have fired more than 6 rounds before he could. Pinto held his breath as his gunner squeezed the ballistic curve into the cold air. And Pinto watched through his binoculars as he fired the round from the Panther's incredible range. The fireball was so bright that German radio later revealed that the tank crew had been convinced they were safe to that extent. But the M36's finest hour came during the defense of Bastonia, where the 101st Airborne had been heavily assaulted. A small group of M36s from the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion had formed the backbone of Bastonia's anti-tank defenses, just hours before the German ring was completely closed, as they stood warily facing the German troops. The crews were operating with limited ammunition after the attack, outnumbered 10-1, but they destroyed more than 30 German tanks and attackers. As the American infantry moved from house to house, a Tiger tank, led by Lieutenant William Wild Bill Henderson, was standing by to kill each other. While Jackson needed to fire at a crucial point to stop the German monster, the roar and the armor-piercing shell hit the Tiger in the front plate. The impact was so severe that the Tiger's gun barrel was completely knocked out, and smoke began to pour from its hatch, saving their tank the ability to save its life. Bastonia. When the siege was finally broken, and the relief forces fought their way into Bastonia, they found 6 M36s still in action, though they all bore marks from bullet holes and shell fragments. And their crews looked as if they had been down for 36 years in a week. The Jackson was only a war winner. During the Battle of the Bulge, German intelligence had launched a crash program to identify and counter this new American weapon, that by January 1945, German tank crews were being told how dangerous it was to destroy the tank. Before long, American production had picked up, and more Jacksons were arriving in Europe every week. But perhaps this was how German strategy had begun to change, having previously been fully on the battlefield. The attacks became more hesitant, less aggressive, as crews became increasingly concerned about being picked off by the increasingly unseen M36. And as the battle entered its final stages, the M36 continued to prove that the German city could hold its own from all sides. This included not only standard Panthers and Tigers, but a monster mounted with a 128mm gun that the Jagd Tiger was considered the ultimate tank killer. But it was met by the M36s at the attenuator. At the Rhine, a single Jagd Tiger controlled the entire bridge, and German commanders were convinced that they were taking out an M36 crew from the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion. And with the fire control system on their tank destroyer, they were able to work their way to a position where they could engage the German monster from its blind side. The result being that the two tanks spent over an hour exchanging fire at long range. The devastating ammunition explosion, which was impenetrable to any Allied gun, was completely destroyed, more importantly, allowing thousands of Allied troops and vehicles to enter Germany, which in turn led the German army to declare the end of the war. With an increasingly desperate and poorly equipped opponent, many German tanks being crewed by hastily trained boys or old men, and mechanical breakdowns becoming more common than combat losses, the Jackson had almost outclassed the German supertankers for the threats it would face by the end of May '53. The Jackson was a major player in the war, but the Pacific Theater planned to send hundreds of Jacksons for the planned invasion of Japan, and the M36's mobility would prove disastrous against Japanese fortifications. The M36 Jackson served in combat for less than a year, from August 1944 to May 1945, before these plans could be put into action. The Allied forces that had lost many years and had a weapon that could operate in the field better than the enemy. But here is what makes the story of the M36 even more remarkable. While most of the weapons of the Great War were retired after 19, the story of what happened in the years after the war is absolutely amazing. And many experts have predicted that the era of tank destroyers is over. But why can a much heavier weapon and better protection for its crew do the job? It seemed logical, and the U.S. Army began to phase out its M36. But other nations saw the Jackson's combination of firepower and mobility, still rebuilding their armies after the devastation of World War II, and modified them to improve their engines and improve their defenses. These types of ammunition would go to fight in Indochina, where their ability to destroy fortified positions kept the Jackson vehicles well maintained, using them as the backbone of post-war armored forces. Some Belgian M36s were also deployed during that country's independence crisis in the 1950s, where they proved effective in urban warfare situations. But the M36's most extensive use came in South Korea, where hundreds of Jacksons were delivered to North Korea in June 1990 as part of U.S. military assistance programs. Among the first American weapons to see action were the North Koreans, armed primarily with Soviet-made T-34 tanks, the same vehicles that had terrorized German forces on the Eastern Front during World War II. But it was a formidable opponent with the JAK 90mm gun. The crews, reaching ridiculous heights, destroyed entire columns of T-34s in minutes. Sergeant Jim Morrison, who served with the 78th Tank Destroyer Battalion in Korea, described one engagement. "We were defending this hilltop position when about 12 T-34s came barreling down the valley in a column. They probably thought they could do the same thing to our positions as they were doing to the South Korean units. Big mistake. We had 4 M36s positioned in flanking positions with overlapping fields of fire. When those T-34s hit our kill zone, it was like a shooting gallery. We destroyed all 12 tanks in about 3 minutes and suffered no casualties. The North Koreans never tried to do it again." The success of the M36s in Korea sparked renewed interest in the vehicle, and American factories briefly resumed production of spare parts and ammunition. Even several M36s were recalled from storage and refurbished for Korean service. It was an unusual situation. A weapon that had been declared obsolete suddenly came back into demand because it was so effective against these specific threats. But perhaps the most surprising chapter in the M36's career came decades later, in the 1990s, during the Yugoslav Wars. As the former Yugoslavia fell apart in a series of bloody conflicts, various factions desperately sought any heavy weapon they could find. Several M36 Jacksons, some of which had been sitting in museums or serving as memorials, were pressed back into active service. Built to fight German Panthers in 1944, these ancient tank destroyers found themselves engaging modern Yugoslav tanks and armored personnel carriers in urban combat. Incredibly, they proved quite effective. The 90mm gun was still powerful enough to destroy most targets it encountered, and Jackson's mobility allowed it to operate in the confined spaces of city streets. Video footage of the siege of Sarajevo actually shows M36s in action. Their distinctive long guns billow smoke as they engaged enemy positions. The sight of these World War II veterans fighting in the 1990s conflict was surreal, but it demonstrated the basic soundness of the M36's design. A weapon that was cutting-edge technology in 1944 was still viable nearly 50 years later, which is something to be said about the vision and skill of the engineers who built it. Over its decades of service, the M36 underwent numerous modifications and upgrades. Some vehicles received new engines for improved reliability. Others received improved fire control systems, including laser rangefinders and ballistic computers. A few experimental models were fitted with reactive armor to protect against modern anti-tank weapons. Each upgrade extended the Jackson's service life and proved that its basic design was robust enough to accommodate new technology. The Israeli military also operated a small number of the M36 during its early conflicts with Arab countries. Israeli crews appreciated the Jackson's striking power, which was especially valuable when engaged in heavily fortified positions. Some Israeli M36s were modified with additional armor and advanced communications equipment, allowing them to serve alongside much more modern vehicles. By the time the last M36s were finally retired from active service in the early 2000s, they had served in conflicts spanning 6 decades. From the frozen forests of Jordan to the jungles of Southeast Asia, from the mountains of Korea to the streets of Seoul, the Jackson had proven its worth time and again. Few military vehicles can claim such a vast and varied combat record. Today, the surviving M36 Jacksons are treasured museum pieces. Their long guns pointing skyward pay silent tribute to the crews who operated them and the engineers who designed them. Walking around one of these vehicles, you're struck by how purposeful every aspect of its design seems. This was no show-off. It was built to kill, and it shows. The massive gun dominates everything else, supported by a turret and hull that exist only to get the weapon where it needs to be. But beyond its technical features and combat record, the M36 Jackson represents something important about American innovation and determination. It was a weapon that wasn't supposed to work. The idea of mounting a massive anti-aircraft gun on a medium tank destroyer chassis was so crazy that most engineers would have dismissed it out of hand. The timeline was impossible, with production schedules that demanded that the vehicle be ready for battle just months after the first prototype was tested. Not only did it work, it exceeded all expectations and became one of the most effective tank killers of the entire war. It is a testament to what can be achieved when brilliant people are given clear objectives, adequate resources, and the freedom to think outside the box. The engineers who built the M36 were not bound by conventional wisdom or conventional methods. They saw a problem, found an innovative solution, and made it work in impossible conditions. The story of the M36 Jackson is also the story of the men who operated these machines. The tank destroyer crews were volunteers, men who had chosen one of the most dangerous jobs in the military. They knew they would be facing the enemy's best tanks, using vehicles that prioritized firepower over safety. Every mission was potentially a suicide mission, and every successful engagement was a testament to their skill, courage, and determination. These crews developed a unique culture and identity within the U.S. military. They saw themselves as hunters, specialists, whose job was to find and destroy enemy weapons. Their unofficial motto was, "Search, strike, and destroy," and they lived up to it every day. Tank destroyer units had the highest casualty rates in the entire military, but they also had the most impressive kill ratio. They were the elite, the tip of the spear, the ones who waited for trouble rather than going looking for it. The psychological profile of a tank destroyer crew member was different from that of a regular tank crew or infantryman. These men had to be aggressive enough to actively seek out enemy tanks, but also patient enough to wait for the perfect shot. They had to be confident in their abilities, while humble enough to admit that one mistake could be their last. It was a difficult balance, and not everyone could handle it. Training for the M36 crew was intense and realistic. They practiced engaging targets at extreme ranges, learning to calculate firing solutions quickly and accurately. They studied German tank identification until they could identify specific vehicles from miles away. They learned to work together as a seamless team, with each crew member knowing what the others would do in any given situation. But perhaps most importantly, they learned to think like hunters. Successful tank destroyer crews didn't just react to threats. They anticipated them. They studied enemy movement patterns identified potential ambush sites, and positioned themselves to take advantage of terrain and visibility conditions. The best crews could read the battlefield like a book, knowing where enemy tanks would appear and how they would move. This hunting mentality extended beyond individual crews to entire tank destroyer battalions. These units operated more like wolves than traditional military formations. They would spread out over a wide area, constantly communicating enemy movements and coordinating their attacks to maximize damage and minimize their visibility. When a German armored column was sighted, multiple M36s would converge on the target area, establishing crossfire patterns that would make escape nearly impossible. The tactical doctrine developed around the M36 was revolutionary for its time. Previous tank-destroying tactics had emphasized static defenses with vehicles parked in ready positions to await enemy attacks. The Jackson's mobility and firepower allowed for much more aggressive tactics. M36 units would actively patrol forward areas, searching for enemy weapons and engaging them as much as possible before retreating to new positions. This hit-and-run style of warfare was a perfect fit for the Jackson's strengths and limitations. The vehicle's thin armor made it vulnerable to sustained firefights, but its powerful gun and good mobility allowed it to quickly attack and escape before the enemy could mount an effective response. This was guerrilla warfare with 70-ton machines, and it drove German commanders absolutely crazy. German intelligence reports from late 1944 show growing frustration with these American tank-destroying tactics. Traditional countermeasures did not work because the M36s never stayed in one place long enough to be targeted. German tank crews found themselves constantly looking over their shoulders, never knowing when or where the next attack would come from. The psychological effect was devastating, turning confident veteran crews into nervous wrecks who jumped at every shadow. The impact of the M36 on German morale cannot be overstated. For years, German tank crews had held the technological edge on the battlefield. Their Panthers and Tigers were virtually invulnerable to most Allied weapons, which gave them a great deal of confidence and an aggressive strategy. The appearance of the Jackson shattered that confidence overnight. Suddenly, every engagement was potentially deadly, and this knowledge influenced every aspect of German armored operations. German tank crews quickly began to adopt a defensive approach, moving more cautiously and avoiding long-range engagements where the M36's superior firepower would have given it an advantage. This defensive mindset was exactly what Allied commanders were hoping to achieve. By forcing German armor to be more cautious, the M36 effectively neutralized most of the tactical advantages that the superior armor design provided. But the Jackson's impact went far beyond its immediate combat effectiveness. The success of the 90mm gun on the M36 platform directly led to its adoption on other American vehicles. The M26 Pershing heavy tank, which began arriving in Europe as the war ended, mounted the same gun in a heavily armored turret. Post-war American tank development was heavily influenced by the lessons learned from M36 operations, particularly the importance of long-range firepower and accurate fire control systems. The M36 also influenced American tank destroyer doctrine for decades after the war. The idea that anti-tank vehicles could be more effective than conventional tanks in certain situations became a cornerstone of American military thinking. This philosophy would later influence the development of vehicles such as the M18, the Hellcat, and various self-propelled anti-tank guns used during the Cold War. International military observers were also taking notice. The British, struggling with their own anti-tank weapons, began a crash program to develop similar high-velocity guns. The Soviet Union, who captured several M36s during the final stages of the war, reverse-engineered many of its features for use in their own tank destroyer programs. Even the Germans, in the final months of the war, began developing similar weapons based on intelligence gathered about the Jackson's capabilities. The technological innovations introduced on the M36 found applications far beyond tank warfare. The advanced fire control system developed for the Jackson influenced post-war artillery design. The power traverse system that allowed the massive gun to track targets rapidly became standard on virtually all subsequent American armored vehicles. Even seemingly minor details, such as the design of the commander's cupola and the arrangement of crew positions, influenced tank design for decades to come. An often overlooked aspect of the M36's design is how crew-friendly it was compared to other tank destroyers of the era. With the spacious fighting compartment providing space for crew members to operate effectively, even during extended combat operations. Well-designed controls and instruments reduced crew fatigue and allowed for more accurate gunnery. These human factors were revolutionary for their time and played a major role in the vehicle's combat effectiveness. The ammunition handling systems on the M36 were also ahead of their time. A large breech at the rear of the turret provided secure storage for ready-to-use rounds, while mechanical loading helped reduce crew workload and increase the rate of fire. These innovations allowed the M36 crew to maintain high rates of accurate fire for extended periods, which was extremely important during the intense combat conditions encountered during the Battle of the Bulge. Maintenance and logistics support for the M36 was another area where American ingenuity shone. The vehicle was designed to use as many common components as possible, simplifying the supply chain and reducing the burden on maintenance personnel. The modular design meant that damaged components could be replaced quickly in the field, keeping more vehicles in service. This reliability and maintainability gave American forces a significant advantage over German units whose complex vehicles required extensive maintenance and specialized parts that were increasingly difficult to obtain. The training programs developed for M36 crews became the model for American tank destroyer training during the Cold War. The emphasis on marksmanship, tactical flexibility, and aggressive leadership produced some of the best tank killers in military history. Many M36 veterans became instructors at armor schools, passing on their knowledge and experience to new generations of tank destroyer crews. But perhaps the M36 Jackson's most lasting legacy is what it represented about American industrial and military capability. It was a weapon that went from concept to combat ready in less than 2 years, a timeline that would be considered impossible today. It required innovations in metallurgy, mechanical engineering, fire control systems, and manufacturing techniques. The fact that it worked so well and so quickly demonstrated the incredible depth of American technological and industrial resources. The story of the M36 also illustrates the importance of getting the right weapon in the right place at the right time. If Jackson had arrived 6 months earlier, the war might have been considerably shorter. If it had arrived 6 months later, it would have been too late to make a difference. The timing was perfect, and that perfect timing was the result of thousands of people working together for a common goal. Looking back at the M36's combat record, some engagements stand out in particular. The destruction of that first Panther in the Ardennes was not just a tactical victory. It was a psychological watershed that changed how both sides viewed armored combat. The long-range kill achieved by Sergeant Pinto demonstrated capabilities that German intelligence had deemed impossible. The successful defense of Bastogne demonstrated that American forces could not only evade German armored attacks, but also decisively defeat them. Each of these engagements contributed to a growing myth that surrounded the M36 and its crew. Stories of Jackson's assassination spread rapidly throughout both armies. German propaganda attempted to downplay the effectiveness of the new American weapon, but their own tank crews knew better. Radio intercepts of German armored units reveal increasing references to the long gun and a growing reluctance to engage in situations where the M36 was present. The intelligence war surrounding the M36 was almost as intense as the shooting war. American forces went to great lengths to prevent intact examples from falling into German hands, while German intelligence made the capture of Jackson a top priority. When a damaged M36 was finally captured by German forces in early 1945, detailed examination revealed the extent to which American tank destroyer technology had become German. Engineers were particularly impressed by the advanced fire control system and the quality of the armor-piercing ammunition. Their analysis concluded that the M36 represented a significant technological leap and recommended the immediate development of countermeasures. However, by this point in the war, Germany lacked the necessary resources and time to mount an effective response. Post-war technical analysis of the M36's performance revealed some surprising statistics. The average M36 crew achieved a kill ratio of over 3.1 against German armor, which was remarkable given their large numbers and the fact that they were operating in enemy territory. The vehicle's mechanical reliability rate was consistently over 85%, even under severe combat conditions. Perhaps more importantly, the survival rate of the crew of the M36 units was significantly higher than that of other American armored vehicles. This was surprising given the Jackson's thin armor and open turret, but it demonstrated the effectiveness of the hit-and-run strategy that the crew of the M36 employed. By engaging at long range and avoiding prolonged firefights, the Jackson crews reduced their exposure to enemy fire. The medical records of the M36 units also reveal interesting patterns. Crew injuries were more commonly caused by small arms fire penetrating the open turret than by direct hits from artillery pieces and tank guns. This led to the development of various field modifications, including improvised turret roofs and improved personal protective equipment for crew members. The psychological impact of operating the M36 was also significant, albeit in a positive way. Crews reported much higher levels of confidence than operators of other American armored vehicles. Knowing that they had a weapon that could reliably penetrate any German armor gave M36 crews an aggressive mindset that translated into tactical success. This confidence was contagious and played a major role in boosting morale throughout tank destroyer battalions. Training accidents were surprisingly rare during the training of M36 crews. Despite the vehicle's powerful weapons and complex systems, reflecting the quality of the training programs and the careful selection of crew members, the tank destroyer service attracted some of the best personnel in the U.S. Army, men who were courageous, intelligent, and naturally aggressive. The logistics chain supporting M36 operations was a marvel of military efficiency. Special ammunition delivery procedures ensured that valuable high-velocity rounds were distributed where they were needed most. Maintenance support was organized around mobile repair teams that could service M36s at forward positions. Training of replacement crews was accelerated to keep pace with combat losses and unit expansion. An often overlooked aspect of M36 operations was the intelligence gathering by tank destroyer crews. Their advanced optics and forward positions made them excellent observation platforms, and many crews supplemented their tank-killing activities with reconnaissance and artillery marksmanship duties. This intelligence was invaluable for planning major operations and understanding German defensive patterns. The M36's influence on post-war military thinking extended far beyond tank destroyer doctrine. The success of the 90mm gun led to its adoption for air defense systems, where its high velocity and accuracy made it ideal for engaging jet aircraft. Many of the fire control innovations on the Jackson found their way into early guided missile systems and radar-controlled guns. The development of the Cold War tank was heavily influenced by lessons learned from M36 operations. The importance of long-range firepower, accurate fire control, and crew survivability became central themes in American tank design. Even today, many of the principles established during the development of the M36 continue to influence military vehicle design. The M36 also had a significant international impact. Countries that operated the Jackson after World War II used it as the basis for their tank destroyer programs. French modifications to their M36s influenced the design of later French armored vehicles. South Korea's experience with the Jackson during the Korean War shaped its approach to defensive operations for decades to come. But beyond all the technological achievements and combat statistics, the M36 Jackson represents something more fundamental about American military capability. It was a weapon system that succeeded because it combined technological innovation with tactical flexibility and individual courage. The engineers who designed it, the factory workers who built it, and the crews who operated it all contributed to its success. The story of the M36 also demonstrates the importance of learning from combat experience and adapting quickly to changing circumstances. This weapon emerged from careful analysis of battlefield failures and represents a direct response to specific tactical problems. It was not designed according to some abstract military doctrine. It was built to solve real problems that were killing American soldiers. As we wrap up this incredible journey through the history of America's most feared tank destroyer, it is worth remembering that the M36 Jackson was more than just a machine. It was a symbol of American ingenuity, determination, and industrial strength. When the odds seemed hopeless, when the German supertank seemed invincible, American engineers and workers came together to create a weapon that not only leveled the playing field, but also tipped it decisively in favor of the Allies. The men who operated these machines were heroes in the truest sense of the word. They volunteered for one of the most dangerous jobs in the military, knowing that they would be actively seeking out the most dangerous enemies on the battlefield. Their courage, skill, and determination made the difference between victory and defeat in some of the most critical battles of World War II. Today, as we face new challenges and new threats, the story of M36 Jackson reminds us of what is possible when free people work together for a common purpose. The same spirit of innovation and determination that created Jackson continues to drive American military development today. Whether we are talking about modern fighter jets, guided munitions, or next-generation armored vehicles, the principles established during the development of the M36 continue to influence how we think about military technology. Jackson's legacy lives on, not only in museums and history books, but also in the institutional lore and traditions of the United States Army. Tank destroyer units may no longer exist as separate formations, but the predatory mentality they pioneered continues to influence American weapon strategies. An emphasis on superior firepower, accurate firepower, and tactical flexibility is central to how American forces approach armored warfare. So the next time you see an M36 Jackson in a museum, or read about its exploits during World War II, remember that you are looking at more than just an old tank destroyer. You are looking at a symbol of what Americans can achieve when they put their minds to it. The Jackson proved that with enough determination, ingenuity, and courage, even the most impossible challenges can be overcome. And that, my friends, is a lesson that is as relevant today as it was in the frozen forests of the Ardennes 75 years ago. The M36 Jackson was not just America's Panther Killer. It was proof that Americans don't give up when faced with an impossible situation. They innovate, they adapt, and they win. If this incredible story of American innovation and battlefield heroism has got you as excited as it has me, you need to subscribe to this channel right now. We're constantly digging up these amazing forgotten stories of military history. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Hit that notification bell too, because YouTube's algorithm loves to bury military history content. And the only way you'll see our latest videos is if you tell the algorithm you want to see them. And here's something else you can do to help. Share this video with everyone you know who loves military history. Whether it's your grandfather who served in World War II, your friend who's into tanks, or that coworker who's always talking about historical documentaries. Send them this link. These stories are worth telling, and they deserve to be heard by as many people as possible. Leave a comment below, and let me know what you think about the M36 Jackson. Do you think it was the most underused weapon of World War II? What forgotten pieces of military hardware do you think deserve the spotlight? Your comments help drive our future content, and I read every one of them. The story of the M36 Jackson proves that sometimes the most incredible weapons are the ones you've never heard of. While everyone talks about the Sherman tank or the German Tiger, it was machines like the Jackson that actually won the war. These are the stories that matter. Forgotten heroes and hidden weapons that changed the course of history. And we're just getting started. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.